Indeed. So welcome everyone at this webinar. I'm going to quickly share my screen. A webinar about procurement for green logistics with two interesting, nicely complementary angles presented first by Anna, who will talk about the role of tender specifications in public procurement and the role of green logistics therein. And then Casper will talk about green transport through public procurement as well, but again with a slightly different angle. Green procurement came up already at the very initial meeting, the kickoff meeting of GLEAM, as one of the potential areas of interest where municipal organizations can stimulate the transition towards sustainable logistics. So I'm very excited that today we'll actually cover that in quite some depth with two presentations that also gives us room for a nice debate. So feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go along. And I will moderate the session in between the speakers who promised to leave enough room for questions so that we have 2 times about half an hour, and I'll try to make sure we finish in time. For those of you who are not aware of the GLEAM project, which by the looks of you are not too many, nice to see so many familiar faces. We are a project centered around cities that are listed on this graph, and we are interested in the transition to green and just transition into green logistics. And this webinar is part of a series which was very packed until now, but then we have a short break and we'll be back with some very interesting webinars about psychologistics and service logistics in the beginning of 2027. Rest assured, in between there will be other interesting events where you can find us and speak to any of us. And anyway, if you want to keep in touch, stay informed, be connected, you can share this link with everyone who's interested. But I don't want to take up too much time, so I will stop sharing and ask Anna to start sharing the screen and give your presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Dreischerf and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Groningen. And together with Paul and one of our other colleagues, Dirk Pieter van Donk, during my PhD a few years ago, I started this project because we realized that municipalities actually play 2 double roles in driving businesses and companies to deliver their goods in a more sustainable or more green manner. And we so on the one hand you have regulations, vehicle access restrictions that municipalities can set, like a low or zero emission zone, time windows, vehicle weight restrictions, for example. But on the other hand, municipalities also procure goods, and in that way they can also set an example for other organizations that drive into the city. And actually municipalities are a large procurer of goods. They buy large volumes, which means they have purchasing power. But that also means they create vehicle movements in the cities, and thereby also create 2 issues related to urban logistics, like congestion, emissions, use of space. Well, when we saw this around us, that municipalities in the Netherlands started to use sustainable logistics questions or award criteria or requirements in their tenders. And we were curious to see, so how does this affect suppliers? Do suppliers then actually procure greener vehicles, or do they start working in a different way because they see these, they are asked or demanded this by public suppliers? So that's what drove us to this research. And before I explain what we did and what we found, I would first like to give a short context of the Netherlands. I think most people know, especially the part on the left. There are progressive urban logistics policies in the Netherlands. So last year, 18 cities implemented a zero emission zone. And as you can see, there will also other cities will follow in the upcoming years. Actually, these zones are still low emission, right? But as of 2030, they will be fully zero emission. So in that sense, also, there are policy measures in the Netherlands that already restrict companies to the vehicle type that they can use, specifically target at emission levels. Also, in public procurement, there are policy measures to stimulate sustainable public procurement. So public buyers need to already use a lot of qualitative award criteria and also aimed at sustainability. And there is also support from the Dutch Public Procurement Expertise Center for specific types of sustainable public procurement, right? So it's not only about urban logistics, but there can also be a lot of other sustainability objectives stimulated through public procurement. And this expertise center has buyer groups also focused on logistics and procurement of transport vehicles, in which public buyers from different cities or buying organizations exchange their experience. So that's a bit of context, so you can to interpret what comes next and what we found in the Netherlands. So first, what did we do? So our research question was, how do tender specifications shape the adoption of sustainable logistics practices by suppliers? So we focus specifically on the procurement of goods and services in the facility category. So facility goods and services like, for example, coffee, but also cleaning services, drinks, food, toilet paper, things like that, that are delivered by suppliers, where transport is not the core service, but it's about the good or another good or service. But transport plays an important role, and there are frequent deliveries involved. But normally, well, the focus is, if you think about sustainability, for example, about coffee, it could be, for example, about coffee, the product that must be there must be a fair trade label. The quality must be good, the machines must work well, but municipalities also impose restrictions or demands on suppliers, or they can actually, to use specific types of vehicles or deliver in a sustainable manner. And that's what we were interested in. So how do different tender specifications, which I will explain in a minute, shape what suppliers do in terms of sustainable logistics in the delivery of these goods and services. So we did that first, starting with the desk research. We analyzed about 100 tenders for facility goods of the 50 largest Dutch municipalities. So these tender documents can be found online. And we read through them, and specifically around the award criteria and requirement section, and looked for what was in them related to sustainable transport. We also analyzed the policy documents from these cities related to city logistics, so SULPs and SUMPs, to see what broader ambitions for sustainable urban logistics these cities had. And then we did a multiple case study. And we selected 8 tenders from these 100 tenders. We selected 8 tenders with different types of specifications to really understand what the effects were of these tender specifications on supplier adoption of sustainable logistics practices. And we looked for variation in the tender specifications. So we looked both at open award criteria, so an open question, as well as a requirement that was more specific or prescriptive, really telling the supplier what they had to do. And we were interested in seeing the difference between these two. So per tender, we interviewed people at the buyer side, so a buying advisor, but also policy advisors on logistics, contract managers, and then also on the supplier side, we interviewed those people that were involved with the tender and with the execution of the contract. Then let's move to our findings. First, what did we find in the desk research? Looking at the policy ambitions, so in these tender documents, in the beginning of the tender, there is this description of the municipality and also often their policy ambitions. So these ranged from very broad ambitions like a livable city to sustainable logistics, for example, or very concrete, our aim is to have an emission-free city center from 2025. Then in the requirements and award criteria, we found that 58% of tenders included one of the two, a requirement or an award criteria, or both, for sustainable urban logistics. Important to note here that we looked at tenders that were published between 2015 and 2020, so it's already 6 years ago. And we saw that this percentage increased over these years, which is likely to reflect the development, of course, of the availability of electric vehicles. So we saw that the percentage increased, but especially the specific requirements for electric vehicles also increased during this period. And then looking at the weight, that becomes quite procurement specific, but award criteria, there are usually multiple. So as the example of coffee that I just gave, there is a quality aspect, right? The taste, there can be a fair trade label. It can be how easy do the machines function, or how well are they able to be used. And for example, how is the coffee delivered? So all of these can be award criteria. And of these criteria, on average, the criterion for sustainable urban logistics counted for 20%. Of course, there's also price, right? So it's always price and qualitative award criteria that determine what supplier is selected. So after we did this analysis, we were interested in how do then these open award criteria affect suppliers, and how do more prescriptive requirements or award criteria affect suppliers' adoption of sustainable logistics. And that's what we found looked at in the interviews. So first, I would like to share what did we find for the open award criteria. So an example here is what could be in a tender is a question that would then be asked, or the suppliers are asked to provide an answer to in their bid. The question would be, to what extent are you able to deliver in a sustainable manner? And then suppliers are required to add 1 or 2 pages of text explaining how they would do this. So what we find in our cases is that had this question and talking to suppliers is that when in most cases, these did not drive suppliers to adopt more sustainable logistics practices. So an answer often would be, or the answers actually really quite varied a lot. So their answer could be, we use a route planning software. We have, for example, or we use different depots near the city, or we have Euro 6 with vehicles with a low emission level, for example. So there could be very different ones. And as you can see in the quote of the buying advisor who said, so we say, dear market, write your best possible plan. And then we get something back that 1 or 2 people have a feeling for, and the rest are really like comparing apples and oranges. The question is whether we have triggered the supplier to improve. So what we learned from not only from this buying advisor, but also from others, is that often suppliers presented their existing practices, but did not really improve or adopt new practices. And this was typical in procurement procedures where there was no room for a contractual adjustment, which because of procurement regulations or public procurement regulations is usually not allowed. There was one case where open questions were effective, and that was when the buyer and supplier were allowed, because they chose a specific procurement method, where they were allowed to develop sustainable solutions during the contract execution. So after contract award, they sat together in many different occasions. They also invested a lot of time in that to decide on, for example, what should the delivery frequency be. Actually, this was more of a pickup frequency because this was a contract for waste collection. And together, the buyer and supplier determined, so how often should these waste bins be picked up without having unnecessary vehicle movements. So that's something that they were able to determine that together, and there were also other examples, right? So they looked at hydrogen trucks, what the supplier could do with that, and some other sustainable solutions were discussed and also worked out. So this way, the buyer and supplier were able to, what they cannot do before the contract is awarded, right? Because then a public buyer must provide suppliers with all the same information, and they cannot work out things already. They could come up with sustainable answers to questions of the buyer that they couldn't have done in a different kind of contract, they thought. But as I said, this requires a substantial time investment both from the buyer and the supplier. While this waste contract wasn't quite a small contract, it was where it's where most energy goes to, the buying advisor said. So if we move on to the more prescriptive requirements or award criteria, for example, a requirement can be that the supplier must use a zero-emission vehicle for the delivery of the goods of this contract, of course. Or award criterion could be that the higher the percentage of routes driven zero emission, the higher the score. So bidders or potential suppliers are scored based on the percentage of routes they can drive zero emission. And we find that these types of specifications actually drove suppliers in the three cases that they were to purchase an electric vehicle for this specific contract. It's important to know that, of course, these vehicles must be technically available, and that's something that the buyers often in these cases had already they knew, or they had found out through market consultations, or also talking to a policy advisor in their own municipality that worked on urban logistics. For example, Rotterdam, I see Jos is here, is a good example of this, where a policy advisor talks to the public buyer, to the buyer or the buying advisor, to share market knowledge and to determine a bid or a solution, determine a question or a demand that is not too ambitious, but does drive suppliers to make that extra step to buy an extra additional electric vehicle, for example. And whereas in the previous example of open questions that can be effective, the investment, the time investment happens especially after the contract was awarded, because when the buyer and supplier can collaborate, if they can. Here, market knowledge is required before, in an early stage of the tendering process, because when developing these requirements and award criteria, the buyers already need to know what is available and what's possible in the market. A third finding that ranges goes a bit, it has to do with both types, is that we find that suppliers also, tenders, actually influence suppliers also beyond the focal contract. So they not only affect suppliers within the contract, but also beyond that. So they, for the prescriptive requirements or award criteria, we found multiple suppliers told us that they actually purchased electric vehicles so that they could be prepared for future public demand. Like the supplier told us in the quote, "What are the requirements which certainly will be asked by public customers? You will have to anticipate that." So they actually anticipate what future requirements will be asked. And they scan through tenders, they read these tenders, and they see that when, for example, the electric vehicles pop up more and more, they will invest in that. Second, for the open award criteria, the first example, of the waste collection contract, where the buyer and supplier collaborated and together developed a sustainable solution, we find this required a large time investment, but the supplier told us that actually the knowledge that they are building there, they on the sustainable solutions, they also use that in other tenders, and then, for example, suggest an innovation there, maybe win the contract, and maybe even set a trend for other municipalities, they told us. So they can, this way, the time investment in one contract actually spreads over, hopefully, multiple contracts and has a broader effect. I have to say with this, these are a few, these are our findings, but it's not what we focused on in this study. So this is something that we would like to explore more in the future as well. So if anyone has any examples of this or has also seen this, I would be interested to learn more about this. Then to finish, some recommendations based on our findings. So as I explained in the different types of specifications, to realize impact, to drive suppliers to adopt more sustainable logistics practices, investment is needed, right? Time investment, people in the buying department, but also maybe in the policy advisors should, spend time getting to know the market or talking to suppliers, collaborating, which can be a high or a large time investment compared to the size of one contract. But it's important to realize that logistics is part of various buying categories. So if the experience from one category can also be used in others. As I said said before with the example of Rotterdam, policy advisors with expertise, right, on sustainable logistics can actually support buyers to both develop tender specifications that are also driving the market forward, and also help buyers to understand, well, because buyers maybe have less experience or understanding of logistics and logistics networks, policy advisors may help buyers to understand how certain specifications actually shape suppliers' behavior or their logistics networks. For example, the delivery frequencies. It has been in a lot of contract or tenders that we looked through in the desk research, there was a demand for next day delivery, which maybe was not perhaps necessary, for example, right? When you think about office supplies, for example, a pen is not something you need the next day. So that's something that, well, talking to policy advisors with the buyers and policy advisors, exchanging insights can help to make this more adapted to, well, what is needed, and then also perhaps to reduce, for example, delivery frequencies. Second, buying organizations can also exchange knowledge and experiences among each other, for example, in buyer groups, both to reduce duplicated efforts. So yeah, these requirements or award criteria that are useful in one or have been used and maybe have been shown to be successful in driving suppliers towards more sustainable practices maybe can also be used in others. But also it can help buyers to formulate consistent expectations in different municipalities or different other public organizations to signal signal suppliers what they value, and then that may help further that suppliers anticipate future demand and invest in more sustainable logistics solutions. That was what I wanted to share. I'm very curious to hear what we will learn from the city of Aarhus. If you have any questions, we can discuss them now, or feel free to send me an email. Thank you.
We have a few minutes. If people have questions now, it's also fine if we move on to Casper first and then group the questions afterwards. Jos.
Yeah, of course, you would expect a question from me after being mentioned so often.
Sorry.
But I was just wondering, Anna, if you could tell us something about the contract management phase, because it's one thing to ask minimum requirements or to award criteria, but you also, especially in the case of monitoring the award criteria, but actually in every case, also in requirements, you need to monitor it. And this is a burden both for the supplier and for the buyer. So perhaps you have some insights to share on that.
Yeah, good question. And this is indeed something that in our interviews came up several times as being a challenge, both because the buying advisor, there are different people involved in contract monitoring or contract management than the people involved in the tender. So there it is important that it's demands that our specifications are also written that are actually that can be monitored. I've heard of examples where some contract managers actually do this, and they really check, okay, what vehicles out the door, checking whether that is indeed, for example, an electric vehicle. There are also some more efficient practices, like, for example, the supplier has to provide the license plate numbers for the vehicles that they will use. Well, I said more efficient. I don't know if it's really efficient. We did not look at that. But suppliers, for example, had to give up their license plate numbers for the vehicles that they would use. And this could then also be monitored or tracked if these are indeed zero emission. And then, but of course, you also have to check whether these really are used. And of course, doing that every time, or even with some sample checks, that's still time intensive, but it's something that is important to do. Yeah.
Okay, I suggest we move on to Casper, and then maybe have some questions by the end. Floor is yours.
Yes, 2 seconds. I'll be there. So, thank you. Okay, yes, my name is Casper, and thank you for inviting me today. I work for the city of Aarhus in Denmark, and today I'm going to share some of our experience with green transport and public procurement here in the city of Aarhus. Over the last few years, Aarhus has worked to reduce transport-related emissions, both our own vehicle fleets and now also in the service and deliveries we purchase from suppliers. So I want to show a few procurements where we succeeded with green transport requirements and award criteria, and also want to tell a little about the challenges we still need to solve in this. First, a little bit about ourselves. I work here in the city of Aarhus, work with green transport. My job title is Fleet Management Coordinator. That's because before we were looking at suppliers, we were looking at ourselves in Aarhus, transitioning our own vehicle fleet to zero-emission vehicles. Work with green employee transport, and also optimize our fleet using AI with a project called Fleet Optimizer. And trying to translate all these political ambitions into our practical requirements that can be used in tenders and contracts. Yes. So why are we focusing on transport? It's one of the largest sources of emissions and has a significant climate footprint here in our city. We purchase large number of transport-related services, including construction, citizen transport, maintenance services, and many other activities which requires transport. It's difficult for us to regulate transport by law. So, for example, if you want road pricing here in Denmark, we need to accept from the Danish government. So we found out that the procurement was a stronger driver for changes because we are buying so much goods and deliveries and services out from the local suppliers. And we want to lead by example. As I said before, in the first years, we were focusing on ourselves. We were transitioning our own vehicle fleet towards zero emission. And today, in the city of Aarhus, we have around 800 vehicles, and we are 80% zero-emission cars. And here from 2026, the rest, vans, minibuses, buses, and trucks, are fossil-free. So we now have a fossil and zero-emission car fleet. And towards 2030, we have to be emission-free on almost every kind of vehicle except trucks. And that's because for us, it's very important when we have demands and requirements for our suppliers, we need to be there ourselves first. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult sitting in a dialogue, in a tender, speaking with suppliers and tell them what they should do. These requirements comes from a green transport plan that our politicians decided back in 2021. And they also made some requirements for our suppliers. They are not as hard, the requirements are not as hard as they are for ourselves. As you can see, they can drive around fossil vehicles all the way toward 2030. That doesn't mean we don't use green transport in our procurements. We can use higher ambitions as an award criteria. And we had some cases where we actually tried to use it as a award criteria. Back in 2022, a tender was conducted for food deliveries. Suppliers were invited to propose a share of transport they could deliver as zero emission. And the share of zero emission transport was used as a key evaluation criteria. And actually, the winning supplier committed to 100% zero emission transport. It's important to say that the winning supplier here operates their own vehicle fleet. That means they are enabling full control of the transition. So that was a good case, and back in 2022, it was early, one of the first steps in our green transport transition. A few years ago, we had another case, construction services. Construction service means plumbing, electricians, and so on. And the requirement here was 100% zero emission transport. But instead of doing from day one, we had to balance these ambitions with the practical implementation. So 2 years from the starting point, back in April last year, they have to drive 100% zero emission. So, and again, like before, when we see crash people, they operate their own cars. A plumber has his own van, so he can manage it himself. And that's where we still face challenges, because we have many suppliers who rely on external transport services. It's not a part of their core business. Transport is just something they use to get their goods out to their buyers. And it's difficult for them to take responsibility for the transport chain. They cannot commit to zero emission. And we see they have limited coordination between actors, the transport service and the suppliers. And that's very difficult for us. And we can see that in the market dialogues we have in the tender process, where many of our suppliers, they don't know what to expect. They don't know what they can commit themselves to, because they feel it's out of their hands. And that's why the dialogue in the tender process is very important before we can implement green transport in our procurements. We need to understand whether the suppliers use their own fleet or external transport services. It is possible to use public procurements to support the transition to green transport, but we need to have clear requirements and many suppliers, and we also can see that many suppliers actually are willing to make the transition to green transport. But we need to balance these ambitions and practical implementation. So a few cases from Aarhus here where we have had success with this. With the went out here. you still see it? So yeah, a few cases from here where we have succeeded making green transport a part of our procurement process. Yes. And if you want to see some material about what have we written in our tender process, you're more than welcome to contact me. Please do that. That was all from here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any questions? I see one in the chat. I will process that as well. Mike?
Oh, hi. Thank you for the two presentations. They're really interesting. I suppose I've got a kind of double question. One was related to the issue that Anna raised, which was about evaluation of how big an impact does this have? So I can see that if you have 100% zero emission transport in the offer of the supplier to come to you, then you could say there's zero emissions. But I suppose, in certain circumstances, maybe they go further than they used to, or maybe their distance is different. So I guess what I'm interested in is what should we evaluate? Is it just emissions, or should we evaluate other things? And related to that, I had a question, because could this be actually since we're focusing often in GLEAM on small and SME companies and even the micro businesses, is there a possibility that in fact this is disadvantageous to small businesses who maybe struggle to make the investment necessary to have this zero emission fleet? And so should we take account of other things beyond the zero emissions side? I guess that's what I'm really asking. But they're both very interesting. Yeah. It's a tricky criticism question or something.
Yeah, thanks. I'll answer the first question. The second question I also wrote down for Casper, so maybe Casper can tell a bit more about that. It is actually, the second thing is something we also heard a lot about. Like, okay, there are multiple sustainability elements or criteria, also justness or equity and small businesses. So, but regarding the first question, so if I understand correctly, you mean looking at, for example, the distances driven by suppliers next to...
Yeah, I was just thinking about, if we replaced all the vehicles with electric vehicles, then we still have congestion, for instance.
Yeah.
So one-for-one replacement it achieves something. It achieves a lot, but it's certain things it doesn't achieve. And if you have to downsize the vehicles in order to get into the zero emission fleet sector, then maybe you make more trips than you used to. So I was just curious as to whether...
Yeah. Yeah, so we actually saw most requests for more greener transport, more electric vehicles, for example. But there were also some demands or specifications in tenders that said something about reducing the distances driven. I have to say, so one very, I think, easily implementable example was that suppliers were scored based on the delivery, the location of their own facilities to the customer, to the buyer, to the municipal offices, for example. That way but for the other part, it's quite difficult to assess, right? What is the distance driven and how do you minimize that? Sometimes it would be an open question, and then a supplier can say, okay, we have a depot at the edge of a city, or we use a hub or an urban consolidation center, those kinds of things. But yeah, it's really difficult to assess, I think, also for researchers, but also for suppliers. So what is this distance? Because suppliers make around with different, with multiple customers, of course. So that also determines the distance. One question also, or one requirement, one city in the Netherlands, The Hague, actually has opened up an urban consolidation center, which was quite big with a lot of different public buyers, that they demanded the suppliers to use. And I think this is one of the urban consolidation centers in the Netherlands that has attracted quite some volume, because both the national government, which is situated in The Hague, the municipality, and other public organizations have used it. So that could be a way. but that has not always attracted volume in other Dutch cities where the same has been tried. So caution
and maybe to
is
follow
necessary.
up also on Jon's question about whether it sometimes also goes into the negative. We also saw examples of that, right, where a supplier actually said, "Sure, I'm willing to buy the zero emission vehicle. I do it just for this one customer. It's actually now I'm going to drive into the city with 2 vans because the one van cannot help." So it is not always going exactly as intended if these requirements are strict. Casper, there's a question from Carolina asking whether you as a fleet manager have cargo bikes or larger cargo bikes in your fleet that you use.
As I said before, we have around 800 vehicles, but we also have around 1,000 electrical bikes, including some of them are cargo bikes, using transport of citizens and also of goods. So yeah, and we also have one supplier actually who is cleaning windows, driving around in our city on bikes in one of our procurements. So that's another case where the green transport went through. And about the other question, as I heard, it was something about smaller suppliers, smaller electricians or plumbers. Are they going to? Is it difficult for them to have to make this to buy these zero emission vehicles? And that's where the dialogue in the tender process is very important. First of all, talk to potential suppliers, but also talk to the trade associations for these construction services companies. I hope that
thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Any questions? As I try also to read the questions in the chat, it would be helpful if someone jumps in and gives me a bit of time.
I have a question for Casper. Did you see experience, or do you have experience? So in your cases, you showed some experience in different categories. So food and construction. Do you see differences among different categories, buying categories, and what kind of demands can be put or placed, or what works in one or doesn't work in another, maybe?
Yeah, it's about this. If they are, how much are we buying from them? Are they operating their own fleet? So how large are the company? Because if they are using external services, I think Bring, GLS, and so on, we can see that there's a very little cooperation between the suppliers and their distribution services. So here for us, it's very difficult to set high requirements for them because they cannot commit themselves.
Yeah. So it's more about do they have their own logistics fleet or outsourced it than what category?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have time now to read the comment of Marij, which is indeed very valuable, right? So we know that public procurement is quite limited, but surprisingly, there's also quite a bit of room if you have enough legal experts that are willing to think along, right? There's these rules that are set by the EU that are strict. Those cannot be changed, of course, but within those rules, quite a lot is possible, and maybe even more than we anticipated. Maybe Anna, you can say something about this rapid impact contracting case that we found.
Yeah, so that's the waste collection case I also described. So this is it's not a procurement procedure, but it's a sort of method that has been applied in the Netherlands in a few cases. Sometimes it's called rapid impact contracting, sometimes rapid circular contracting, and it's mainly aimed for when the buyer doesn't know what the best sustainable solution is, and best, I mean, in quotations. So, so what happens there is the first part of the procedure is quite quickly. So a buyer states their ambitions. Then suppliers can respond by explaining in their bids how they would work out these ambitions with more a plan, not a specific solution, but a plan. And then when the contract is awarded, the buyer, together with the awarded supplier, works out the sustainable solution. That in this case went from delivery frequencies, determining that, but also the size of the waste bins, for example, to what if the supplier could use hydrogen trucks, and the supplier even then discussed that further with their supplier, their truck supplier. So yeah, that's what this method was used for. Yeah.
Thanks. Jos.
Yeah, I have actually a remark from practice. As most of the listeners probably know, we have a zero emission zone already effective, which makes it more or less redundant to require zero emission delivery to at least part of our working locations, but still quite a number are outside the zone. So that has more or less complicated the process of requiring zero emission deliveries, because they are already required for anyway for zero emission zone. So a criterion we have considered lately is to just make it as simple as possible by saying, okay, tell us from which date you will make 100% zero deliveries. That way we avoid, let's say, to make it extra complicated to specify for this locations, you need to do it anyway. And also it makes it easier for the company to make a realistic approximation. And also, of course, there will be some competition between officers. So that is, I think, one practical thing when introducing a zone which does not cover the whole of the city or the. And one other question I do have to Anna and Casper both is, did you get any feedback on sanctions? Because it's still possible. We had fortunately only one case, but where a supplier did not live up to the things they promised in the offer, and then of course you have to consider, what are we going to do? So our first approach was to define, make it a very heavy penalty. So if you don't meet your promise per year, it will cost you a percentage of the contract sum, so that it would really hurt them if they didn't take it seriously. But then on the other hand, if there are things which they couldn't foresee, of course, you have to be lenient. Do you have any feedback on that from practice? I'm curious.
Maybe Casper first.
We haven't had any cases yet where we have to fine anyone. Of course, it's a lot of. We are not standing out and watching what car are they driving in. Of course, it's public information. What does a plumber own? What kind of car fleet does he own? So we can see if he has the cars. But if he has two cars, one is zero emission and one is fossil, we can't see which one he's going in on the day he's driving to a school to make a task for us. So, yeah.
But in a way, maybe that also doesn't matter, right? So if the idea is that you want to enhance the green transition, you did, even if they use that electric vehicle somewhere else. Maybe you paid for it as a government, and that's maybe not what you intend to do, but maybe it's not an issue per se, except for a contract breach with it, which it is, of course.
But of course, we have all our contracts. We have contract managers who is going to follow up on all our suppliers, and one of them is they can ask for documentation that they have been doing zero emission if they promised.
Anna, anything to add?
Not really, actually. So what I already answered Jos before, we did not find much more.
So
I think that actually Marij.
Yeah.
After this, let's move to Marij's question.
I was struck a bit by maybe Casper, you just sort of contradicted it, but we were struck in the interviews how little proof there was that actual management was taking place, right? So honestly, many people told us we don't know. Like, we believe the supplier will act in good faith, but we don't have really the means to test or indeed to sanction if things go wrong. Jos? Or Casper, sorry. Casper first.
Just a little answer to that. It's correct. we are not walking around on the parking places in the city of Aarhus and watching them. As said before, we can ask them for documentation. Are you driving this car? They can say yes, but we actually don't know if they did it. So yeah, it's a reliability.
Yes.
We try to make it as practical as possible. I think I told Anna in the interview that we actually award also the way in which the supplier is going to report on their performance, their sustainability performance, and on the way they allow us as a buyer to test that, so to make inspections occasionally. That allows them to report in a way which is convenient for them, so not too much of a burden, and gives us confidence and still the possibility to check now and then without the obligation to do it every 3 months in a ritual, so to speak. So it is at least, let's say, a practical approximation. It's still not watertight, so to speak, but I think it's quite an approach which you can easily explain, and it's quite acceptable, to my experience, for suppliers who have to make a bid.
Marij, do you want to accompany your comment? It was not really a question, or do you want to leave it with the comment as is? I see that people have looked at it and.
I think it's fine. I was just thinking that it would make sense to offer green transports for short chain fruit, and then all of a sudden that got very complicated. And I can imagine that for bigger contracts it's even, I mean the same rules apply, but I was a bit surprised then.
Yeah, we've seen this example also in our interviews or cases where, for example, a municipality wants to, for example, have a hub or something else, and then they found out, oh wait, there is an ongoing contract. We cannot just change that. So I've also heard examples of municipalities where they, also hear that the policy advisor interacts with the buying advisor to make sort of agenda. So they know, of course, when a contract ends. Well, sometimes it's extended then, but and then, that there is really an agenda needed to make sure that at the right time the policy advisor is involved. And it's
and indeed, you cannot even make changes that are also beneficial for the supplier, right? Because that would be unfair to the suppliers you once told no, who maybe would have won that contract if they were allowed to do it that way. For example, with this one of these recommendations from Anna is to also look at your own processes, right, as a municipal organization, and the requirements that derive from that and whether that's actually needed, which is all good if you set up a new contract. But with existing contracts, you cannot make that change as easily because you will have inadvertently made it worse for potential bidders that did not win. Jos?
I think there is perhaps a trend going on. I want to refer to the recent interview with the retiring director of the company which maintains the rail infrastructure in the Netherlands, ProRail director, who publicly admitted passing by the public procurement regulation by admitting extra work to the company without an extra, because of the, let's say, the efficiency and also the public interest. So perhaps it's also useful to, let's say, not just let your, let's say, bow your head and let it all go, but say, no, if this is not really effective for the public interest and also not for the companies, then perhaps we should think of a way to try and bend the rules a little in the right direction again, because we may have some overshoot in the regulation part there.
Actually, we have at the University of Groningen, we have a colleague who's more on the law side of things that is very active on LinkedIn and other social media and is very influential also in the European policy space, who is advocating for this reality check as well. Some things work, some things don't. Maybe we got carried away a bit too much with some of the aspects, and indeed, but yeah, as municipalities now, we need to adhere, and also as universities, by the way, we need to adhere to the EU law as is. Okay, with that, I want to give everyone time for a quick restroom stop or coffee before they go on to their next meetings. I think this is also a nice and natural point to end this webinar. Thanks everyone from the GLEAM team who was here, but also again, a special thanks to everyone that is not part of the consortium and was attending. I hope you found it very useful, and we'll see you again in one of the next webinars. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.